The phone sits on the kitchen counter, face up, screen dark. She glances at it while she stirs a pot of something that used to feed 4 people and now feeds 1. It has not rung today. It did not ring yesterday either. She tells herself is busy, that grown children have their own lives now, that this is simply how things go. But some nights, long after the dishes are dried and put away, she finds herself replaying old sounds, a school bus pulling up outside, sneakers thudding down the hallway, a voice calling out Ma from another room, needing her for something, anything. The house is quieter now in a way that has nothing to do with noise. Most people assume this is just what happens when children grow up. They call it the empty nest, hand her a phrase, and expect her to nod and move on. But what she is living through is something the phrase was never built to hold. Her child is not gone. He calls sometimes. He visits on holidays, sits at her table, hugs her at the door. And yet something has shifted so quietly that she can't point to the moment it happened. She is still his mother. She has simply stopped being needed the way she once was, and no one warned her how much that would ache. The empty nest, as most people describe it, is about an empty house. What she is feeling is different. The rooms are the same size. The furniture hasn't moved. What changed is invisible, a shift in who reaches for whom first, whose voice gets returned within the hour and whose within the week. She could fill the guest room with anything she wanted and it wouldn't touch what's actually missing. This isn't a space that needs filling. It's a role that needs redefining, and no one ever taught her how to do that gently. This is the part rarely spoken aloud. A woman can grieve a relationship that is still alive. There is no funeral for this kind of loss, no casserole left on the porch, no one asking if she's okay. Culturally, she was raised to see motherhood as a role that never ends, a title that only grows heavier with love, not lighter. So when her adult child pulls toward independence, a new job, a new partner, a life she is no longer at the center of, she interprets the distance as something she did wrong, rather than something that was always supposed to happen. Psychologists who study family systems describe this shift as a renegotiation of attachment, not a rupture of it. The bond doesn't disappear. Its shape changes, and that change requires both people to learn a new way of relating to each other. For the mother, this means learning to hold love without control, presence without dependency. For the adult child, it often means learning independence without guilt. But knowing the theory doesn't soften the 9 p.m. silence when the phone stays dark, or the ache of hearing "I'll call you back" and waiting 3 days for that call. There's a specific kind of confusion that comes with this stage, because the signals are mixed rather than clear. If the relationship had simply ended, grief would have a shape she recognizes. But it hasn't ended. He still says "I love you" at the end of every call. He still shows up for her birthday. So the part of her that wants to name this as loss keeps getting interrupted by evidence that the relationship is, by every visible measure, fine. This is what researchers call ambiguous loss, grief without a clear boundary, mourning something that is simultaneously present and absent. It is one of the most disorienting forms of emotional pain precisely because there's no clean way to explain it, even to herself. Go back far enough and you can find the moment this pattern was built. A Sunday after church, the whole family crowded into a small kitchen, gospel music low on the radio, someone's grandmother stirring greens on the stove while 3 generations moved around each other without needing to ask permission to exist in the same space. Motherhood, in that kitchen, was never a single relationship. It was communal, constant, woven into every hand that reached for a plate. To be a mother, they're meant to always be needed, always be central, always be the one people came home to. That memory shaped an entire generation of women to measure their worth by how essential they remained. So when that centrality fades, as it naturally does, it doesn't just feel like a life stage. It feels like disappearing. There is also something uniquely heavy carried by Black mothers in this stage of life, something rarely named in mainstream conversations about aging or parenting. For decades, many of these women held the emotional weight of entire families, not just their children, but siblings, parents, sometimes neighbors' children too. Strength was not simply admired, it was required, expected, assumed. And so when a grown child pulls back, there is often no cultural permission to say, "This hurts. I miss being needed." Instead, She swallows it, because that is what she was taught strength looks like. But strength was never supposed to mean silence about her own grief. Picture her now, a few years into this new stage. Sunday dinner is smaller. Maybe her son brings his partner, and for the first time in years, she is not the one deciding what's for dessert. She watches him laugh at something someone else said, comfortable, at ease, and she feels two things at once: pride, because she raised a man capable of building his own joy, and a quiet ache, because that joy no longer needs her at its center. Both feelings are true. Neither cancels the other out. This is what emotional maturity in motherhood actually asks of her, to hold contradiction without needing to resolve it. It would be easy to romanticize this stage, to say it's simply a season of letting go and finding peace. But honesty requires more nuance than that. Some mothers do find real freedom here, time returned to them, identities rebuilt outside of caregiving, relationships with their adult children that deepen into something closer to friendship. Others sit in real loneliness, especially if the distance from their child came with unresolved conflict, or if their sense of self was never separated from the role of mother in the first place. Neither experience is wrong. Both are real, and both deserve to be spoken about without shame. It also matters that not every version of distance looks the same. For some mothers, the shift comes gradually, softened by regular calls and visits that simply carry less weight than they once did. For others, it arrives sharper: a child who becomes consumed by a new marriage, a demanding career, or a household of his own, leaving contact that feels more like an obligation fulfilled than a bond maintained. And for a smaller number, the role reverses entirely with age or illness, and the mother who once held everyone together becomes the one who is held, which brings its own complicated grief, not for distance, but for the loss of being the strong one. Naming these differences matters, because the advice that helps one woman rebuild closeness might do nothing for another whose situation calls for something closer to acceptance. What tends to shift things is not forcing closeness back into its old shape, but building a new one. Some women find this through small, deliberate rituals: a weekly phone call that isn't about checking in but about simply talking, the way friends do. A recipe passed along not because it's needed, but because it's a reason to stay in touch. A standing Sunday text that asks nothing except how the week went. These gestures work not because they recreate the old closeness, but because they replace it with something smaller and more sustainable: connection that doesn't depend on need. Others rebuild identity outside of motherhood entirely, returning to something they set aside decades ago: a hobby, a friendship, a version of themselves that existed before anyone called her Ma. Maybe it's the choir she left when the children were small. Maybe it's a garden, a book club, a trade she never finished learning. This isn't about replacing her child with a hobby. It's about remembering that she was a full person before she became someone's mother, and that person is still in there, simply waiting for room to breathe again. The relationship with the adult child doesn't have to shrink for the mother's life to grow. It can do both. There is a particular kind of dignity in a woman who learns to sit with this stage honestly, who stops performing endless availability and starts asking herself what she actually needs now. Not less love for her child. Not less pride in who has become. Just permission to also mother herself for a while, after decades of pouring everything outward. That permission doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in small moments. The first time she makes plans on a Sunday instead of waiting by the phone in case he calls, and doesn't feel guilty about it. The first time she tells a friend, honestly, that the distance hurts, instead of insisting she's fine. The first time she looks at a photo of him as a boy and feels warmth instead of loss. None of these moments erase the ache completely. But together, they build something steadier than the ache, a version of motherhood that no longer depends on being needed every day to still be real. The phone may stay quiet tonight. The kitchen may stay smaller than it used to be. But somewhere in that quiet, something else is also true. She raised a life capable of walking forward without her holding every step. That was always the point. Not to be needed forever, but to matter enough that he no longer needs to be. The love doesn't end where the need does. It simply learns a new way to stay.